Learning is the acquisition of knowledge or skills through experience, study, or being taught. Psychology is a field that is very concerned with learning. Learning is at the center of our lives. Learning theory is paramount to our advances in understanding human, animal, and other living organisms. Meet James. James is my dog. He came to me as a feral dog who lived in the north, who was saved and moved to Aurelia Campus Veterinarian Clinic and adopted and trained by me. James and I are now part of the Canine Ambassador program at Georgian College. We are a visiting team on campus where we provide therapeutic experiences to our campus community. We are also part of a national study. Dr. Stibbards and I are co-researchers. James learned to be a great companion and a canine ambassador because of consistent teaching and learning strategies that are detailed in this week's lesson. In Chapter 6, we will explore learning. Learning is any relatively durable change in behavior or knowledge due to experience. This experience and this change is going to be discussed in this particular chapter. So, for example, phobias, which are irrational fears of any specific object or situation, or agoraphobia, which is an intense fear of being in public places where it might be difficult to escape from or it might be difficult to obtain help if needed, are conditions that are learned. And conditioning involves learning connections between events that occur in an organism's environment. Classical conditioning explains how a neutral stimulus can acquire the capacity to elicit or draw forth a response originally elicited by another stimulus. So when we look at classical conditioning, which is really the root of our understanding of how organisms learn, Ivan Pavlov was a prominent Russian psychologist in the early 1900s who did some Nobel Prize-winning research on digestion and discovered, partly by accident, that dogs will salivate when in response to the sound of a tone, and in doing so he discovered something called classical conditioning. In the classical conditioning, the UCS, the unconditioned stimulus that elicits an unconditioned response without previous conditioning, is what Pavlov's meat powder was, the unconditioned stimulus. The UCR, or the unconditioned response, is unleashed reaction to a UCS, a unconditioned stimulus, that occurs without previous conditioning. So, for example, salivating. Salivating happens and it doesn't require previous conditioning. The CS, or the conditioned stimulus, is a previously neutral stimulus that has acquired the capacity to elicit a conditioned response. And so, for example, in Pavlov's case, the sound of a tone or his bell. And the CR, which is the conditioned response, is a learned condition to a conditioned stimulus. So, for example, the CR here being an example of salivating, the dog salivating to the sound of the tone. So let's look a little further at this particular context. In classical conditioning, in figure 6.1, we see an experimental arrangement similar to the one depicted here, and has typically been used to demonstrate a classical conditioning. Although Pavlov's, as you can see, original setup was a little different, or quite different actually. The dog is restrained in a harness. A tone is used to condition the stimulus, the CS, and the presentation of meat powder is used as the unconditioned stimulus. The tube inserted into the dog's salivary gland allows precise measurements of the salivation response. And in this case, the pen and rotating drum of paper on the left is used to maintain a continuous record of this salivation flow. So the less elaborate setup that Pavlov originally used collected saliva on each trial as shown here. And so what happened is as the dog becomes classically conditioned, the presence of a bell or the tone can elicit the salivation. How does that work? The sequence of events in classical conditioning are described here. So if we take a close look at the processes of classical conditioning, you can see that the unconditioned stimulus elicits the unconditioned response, but the neutral stimulus does not. So tone, for example, the neutral stimulus has no response. The unconditioned stimulus, which is the meat powder, has an unconditioned response, which is salivation. The neutral stimulus, the NS of a tone, plus the UCS, the meat powder, begins to paired with the unconditioned stimulus, and what you get is an unconditioned response of salivation. After this conditioning period, the neutral stimulus alone elicits the response. The neutral stimulus is now the conditioned stimulus, and the response to it is the conditioned response. So the conditioned stimulus is the tone, and the conditioned response is the salivation. Without meat powder, we, or Pavlov learned that he could elicit salivation. In summary, an original neutral stimulus comes to elicit a response that it did not previously elicit. So when you have the conditioned stimulus to the tone, and you pair it with the unconditioned stimulus, the meat powder, you then get the tone becomes a conditioned stimulus that has a conditioned response. And so salivation will occur with tone alone and or with tone and meat powder, or meat powder alone. So you can look a little further here in terms of classical conditioning and fear response. So many emotional responses that would otherwise be puzzling can be explained by classical conditioning. In the case of one person's bridge phobia, the fear originally elicited by her father's scare tactics became a conditioned response to the stimulus of the bridge. So you can see here how a bridge now is conditioned with the father's scare tactics and becomes a conditioned response and elicits fear. Or an unconditioned response. Classical conditioning is also used in advertising, not to create fear, but to encourage people to elicit pleasant experiences of their ads, which of course is meant to encourage people to buy the products. In this particular case, in these ads, advertisers tend to make their products conditioned stimulus that elicits a pleasant emotional response by pairing their products with attractive or popular people like stars, or create a sexual imagery. In that case, the conditioned stimulus, the product, which is genes, then has and elicits a conditioned response, which is a pleasant emotional response. So both conditioning and learning can take place both to influence us and or to shape our behaviors and or emotional responses or feelings. So let's look at classical conditioning, and let's look at terminology and procedures that are part of the classical conditioning research. So a trial is a pairing of the UCS and the CS. So in this particular case, how many times have the tone and the meat powder been paired? Some behaviors are learned after only one trial or pairing, while others take many trials to learn. Acquisition refers to the initial stage of learning a response to acquiring the response. And conditioning has shown to depend on stimulus conditioning, that is, the occurring of stimulus and stimuli occurring in time and space. So there are three types of classical conditioning: a stimulus conditioning where the CS and the UCS begin and end together. So you're presenting the bell and the meat together at the same time at beginning and end. A short delayed conditioning where the CS begins just before the UCS end together, and trace conditioning where the CS begins and ends before the UCS is presented. So when do you sound the tone in a classical conditioning task? Or what works best? Of the three types of conditioning: stimulus, short delayed, and trace. Short delayed conditioning appears to be the most in terms to promote acquisition of classically conditioned responses, and ideally the delay should be very brief and about a half a second. So So let's look at more processes in the classical conditioning paradigm. We talked about acquisition, now let's look at extinction. Extinction occurs when CS and the UCS are no longer paired and the response to the CS is weakened. We know that the response is still there, just not active because of what we call spontaneous recovery, and this is when an extinguished response reappears after a period of non-pairing. Generalization occurs when conditioning generalizes to additional stimuli that are similar to the CS. So, for example, in Watson and Rayner's study with little Albert, who was conditioned to fear the white rat, but later became afraid of many white furry objects. Discrimination is the opposite of generalization. That is, the response is to a specific stimulus. Similar stimuli don't work. Higher order conditioning occurs when a CS function as if it were a UCS to establish new conditioning. So for in this case, condition to response to a tone and saliva, and then pair the tone with a light is what we call a higher order conditioning. Evaluative conditioning refers to changes in the liking of stimulus that results from pairing a stimulus with other positive or negative stimulus or stimuli. The renewal effect can occur when an organism has a classically conditioned association extinguished in an environment that differs from where the association was originally conditioned, and the conditioned response can return when the organism returns to the original environment. So let's look at the evolutionary and biological effects of conditioning, and in this particular case look at conditioned taste aversion and the sauce Béarnaise syndrome. A number of years ago, a prominent psychologist, Martin Seligman, dined out with his wife, and he enjoyed a beautiful steak dinner with a Béarnaise sauce. And if anybody doesn't know what a Béarnaise sauce is, it's a beautiful, creamy, buttery, delicious sauce that some people use on top of their steaks. About 6 hours afterwards, he developed a wicked case of stomach flu and endured some severe nausea. Subsequently to this dining experience, when he ordered sauce Béarnaise, he was cringed to discover that the aroma alone nearly made him throw up. Seligman's experience was not unique, of course. Many people develop aversions to food that has been followed by nausea from illness, alcohol intoxication, or food poisoning. Lots of research in this area, and many of us in the world have had this experience. However, Seligman was puzzled by what he called the sauce Béarnaise syndrome, and on one hand, it appeared to be straightforward result of classical conditioning. A neutral stimulus, the sauce, was paired with an unconditioned stimulus, the flu, which caused an unconditioned response, the nausea. Hence, the Béarnaise sauce became conditioned stimulus eliciting nausea. So you can see figure 6.9 that I'm showing here that shows you that. On the other hand, Seligman recognized that his aversions to Béarnaise sauce seemed to violate certain basic principles of conditioning. So firstly, the lengthy delay in 6 hours between the CS, the sauce, and the UCS, the flu, should have prevented conditioning from occurring. As I mentioned, laboratory studies, a delay of more than 30 seconds between the CS and the UCS make it difficult to establish a conditioned response. Yet, this conditioning occurred in just one pairing. Second, why was it only the Béarnaise sauce that became a CS eliciting nausea? Why not other stimuli that were present in the restaurant? So, for example, plates, knives, tablecloths, and his wife, for example, would trigger nausea. The riddles of Seligman's Béarnaise sauce syndrome were solved later on in 1989 when his colleagues from John Garcia, who conducted a series of studies on conditioned taste aversion. And in these studies, they manipulated the kinds of stimuli preceding the onset of nausea and the noxious experiences in rats using radiation and artificially induced nausea. And they found that when taste cues were followed by nausea, rats quickly acquired conditioned taste aversions. However, when taste cues were followed by other types of noxious stimuli, such as shocks, for example, rats did not develop conditioned taste aversions, and then so furthermore visual and auditory stimuli followed by nausea, who failed to produce the conditioned aversion. So in short, Garcia and his colleagues found that it's of utmost importance to create certain associations, whereas taste nausea associations and other odor nausea associations were most impossible to prevent. And so what is the theoretical significance of all this? Well, the idea here is that we know that Béarnaise sauce becomes a CS, and not only other stimuli present in the illness, but that taste aversions will develop with taste as the neutral stimuli, and other types of neutral stimuli are the byproduct of what we call an evolutionary history of mammals as an adaptive mechanism to ensure that we do not take chances eating things that might make us sick and kill us. So that is a real powerful evolutionary effect, and so that's something that's really interesting that comes out of this idea of conditioning and evolutionary and biological effects of conditioning with respect to what we eat. Let's move on to preparedness now. Preparedness involves a species-specific predisposition to be conditioned in certain ways, but not others, and so it explains phobias. And snakes and spiders are so much more prevalent than other animals or stimuli that are dangerous, as genuine threats to our ancestors evolved as adaptive mechanisms to minimize death, and of course, this changes our evolutionary history. Neuroscience has shed light on the role of our amygdala and our cerebellum in classical conditioning associations, as well as the subliminal cues that have been used to raise self-esteem, and subliminal conditioning may have applications in the treatment of psychological issues. And neuroscience is really looking at the idea of subliminal conditioning to treat psychological disorders.